On April 2, 1912, the largest moving object ever built by human hands slipped out of Belfast harbour and turned south toward open water, a floating monument to what a small Irish port city could achieve when it decided to outbuild the rest of the world. 9 days later, it was at the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean, and the shipyard that built it, Harland and Wolff, watched its single greatest engineering triumph become, almost overnight, the most famous disaster in maritime history. That's the story most people already know about Belfast. It isn't actually the tragedy that defines this city's 20th century, not even close. 60 years after the Titanic went down, the same shipyard, the same streets, the same Protestant and Catholic communities who had built ships together for generations, tore each other apart in a conflict that killed more than 3,500 people and wounded roughly 50,000 more. Over 3 decades of bombings, shootings, and walls built specifically to keep neighbours apart. Today, the site where the Titanic was designed and launched is Northern Ireland's single biggest tourist attraction, drawing over 800,000 visitors a year to a museum built almost exactly where the keel was laid. Belfast survived building the most famous shipwreck in history. What it barely survived was itself. The mechanism running underneath this whole story is uncomfortable, but it's honest. Belfast built its fortune on an industry that required 2 communities, divided by religion and by centuries of mutual suspicion, to work side by side every single day on the same slipways. And the city never actually resolved the deeper division between them, only channeled it into shared labour for as long as the orders kept coming. For a while, shared ambition and steady wages were enough to paper over that division, or at least to keep it from boiling over into the streets. Eventually, when the work dried up and the ambition had nowhere left to go, it wasn't enough anymore, and the same city that had built the largest ship in the world spent the next 3 decades tearing itself apart instead. The name Belfast comes from the Irish Beal Fairste, meaning the mouth of the sandbank ford, a description of the crossing point on the River Lagan, where the settlement first took shape, long before anyone imagined it as an industrial power. For centuries, it stayed a modest market town, its fortunes tied loosely to the linen trade that Ulster had built across the wider region, spinning and weaving flax into cloth that got shipped out through Belfast's small harbour to markets across Britain and beyond. Unlike Dublin or Cork, where wealth tended to flow from land, trade, or inherited lineage, Belfast had none of those traditional advantages, no ancient aristocracy, no natural deep harbour, nothing beyond a modest river crossing and a population willing to work. What changed everything starting in the mid-19th century was industrial-scale shipbuilding, and the 2 men most responsible for that shift weren't even from Belfast at all, arriving as outsiders to build something the city had no obvious reason to expect, on a stretch of reclaimed riverbank that barely qualified as land. Edward Harland was a Yorkshireman, son of a doctor and inventor educated at Edinburgh Academy before starting a 5-year engineering apprenticeship at 14. Trained in the shipyards of Newcastle and Glasgow, he arrived in Belfast in 1854 at the age of 23 to manage a struggling shipyard on a reclaimed strip of land in the River Lagan called Queen's Island. He rose quickly from draftsman to yard manager, and just 4 years later, in 1858, at only 27 years old, he bought the entire failing operation outright for £5,000, financed with help from a Liverpool businessman named G.C. Schwaber, and renamed it Edward James Harland and Company. In 1861, he brought in his own former personal assistant as a full partner, a Hamburg-born engineer named Gustav Wilhelm Wolff, who had moved to England as a teenager and served his own apprenticeship in Manchester before joining Harland's staff. The renamed firm, Harland and Wolff, would go on to recruit a chairman named William Peary, personally brought in by Harland himself, and the 3 of them built, from a marshy man-made island in the middle of a river that had no natural advantage over any of its rivals, what became the largest and most technically advanced shipyard on Earth. Wolff himself later summed up the division of labour among the 3 men with characteristic dryness. Harland built the ships, Peary made the speeches, and he, Wolff, smoked the cigars. The bet those 2 immigrants made was straightforward and enormous for its time, that a small Irish port with no natural advantage over Glasgow or Liverpool could outbuild both of them through pure engineering ambition and relentless reinvestment in the yard itself. It worked spectacularly. By 1900, Harland and Wolff employed 9,000 people, its cranes visible from across the city and its order books filling years in advance. Contracts with the Bibby Line gave the young company its first real momentum in the 1860s, and from there the order books only grew, drawing further business from shipping lines across the British Empire and beyond. Belfast's population exploded alongside the yard, climbing from roughly 25,000 people in 1808 to 70,000 by 1841, and past 385,000 by 1911. Transformed almost entirely by industry rather than trade, land, or inherited wealth, which made Belfast genuinely unusual among Irish cities of the era, a place where a working man's prospects depended on the shipyard's order book rather than on which family he'd been born into. By the outbreak of the First World War, the shipyard's workforce had climbed toward its eventual peak of 35,000 men, and the firm had become the exclusive builder of White Star Line's Olympic-class liners. The Olympic, the Britannic, and the ship whose name would eventually eclipse the company that built her, the Titanic. The legitimization of Belfast's ambition arrived the moment those liners launched, each one a global media event in its own right, drawing dignitaries, journalists, and enormous crowds from across the British Empire to watch steel hulls the size of city blocks slide into the River Lagan. And it's here that Belfast's story takes its first ironic turn, because the single most famous product this shipyard ever produced sank on its maiden voyage, in front of the entire world, killing more than 1,500 people and turning the yard's greatest technical achievement into a byword for hubris almost overnight. Remarkably, this didn't sink the company itself. Harland and Wolff kept building ships, kept growing through the interwar years, and would go on to construct vessels for the Royal Navy through both World Wars. The Titanic's failure absorbed into the yard's history as tragedy rather than epitaph. What did eventually break the city wasn't a shipwreck. It was the fact that Harland and Wolff's workforce, like much of Belfast's industrial economy, was overwhelmingly Protestant, a hiring pattern that had hardened over generations into something close to unofficial policy. And that reflected and reinforced a much older sectarian divide between Protestant Unionists, who wanted Northern Ireland to remain part of the United Kingdom, and Catholic nationalists who wanted it to join the Republic of Ireland. That divide, simmering for generations beneath the surface of daily life, detonated into open conflict in the late 1960s, in a period that became known simply as the Troubles. British troops were first deployed onto Belfast streets in August 1969, initially as a stabilising force and quickly becoming a fixture of daily life for a generation. For nearly 3 decades afterward, Belfast streets saw bombings, shootings and assassinations as a matter of routine, carried out by paramilitary organisations on both sides of the divide alongside British security forces. Rubber baton rounds and later plastic ones became standard crowd control equipment, with tens of thousands fired over the following years. Physical walls, euphemistically called peace lines, went up between Catholic and Protestant neighbourhoods, some of them extending for miles and still standing today, taller in places than the Berlin Wall ever was. Public space itself became coded by religion, streets and parks understood by everyone as Catholic, Protestant, or occasionally carefully mixed, with residents navigating invisible boundaries as automatically as street signs. By the time the Good Friday Agreement finally ended the worst of the violence on April 10, 1998, ratified by referendum with 71% support on both sides of the Irish border, more than 3,500 people were dead and roughly 50,000 had been wounded, in a conflict so intense relative to Northern Ireland's small population of under 2 million that one historian later compared its scale proportionally to the American Civil War. Even the peace itself arrived unevenly. Just 4 months after the agreement was signed, a car bomb in the town of Omagh killed 29 people in the single deadliest attack of the entire conflict. A grim reminder that ending a war on paper and ending it in practice are two very different achievements. Several forces compounded across those same decades to gut Belfast's shipbuilding industry specifically, even as the wider political violence dominated headlines and understandably drew most of the world's attention. global shipbuilding capacity shifted decisively toward Japan and later South Korea from the 1960s onward, undercutting European yards on price and speed in exactly the way it would later hit Liverpool and Bilbao on the other side of the continent. The Troubles themselves scared off decades of outside investment that a modernizing shipyard would have desperately needed to stay competitive, since few international shipping clients wanted to sign long contracts tied to a city known internationally at the time, primarily for car bombs and gunfire, rather than engineering. Harland and Wolff was kept artificially alive for years afterward through nationalization in 1977 and continued government subsidy, not purely for economic reasons, but because throwing thousands of working-class Protestant men suddenly out of work risked destabilizing an already fragile and violent political situation even further, a calculation historians have since confirmed was made explicitly at the highest levels of government in London. Shipbuilding at the yard finally ended in the early 2000s, decades after the industry that had made Belfast famous had effectively already died elsewhere in the world, and the company itself went into administration in 2019. Its once 35,000-strong workforce reduced to a small fraction of that number doing structural and offshore engineering work instead of building ships at all. The reinvention, when it finally came, leaned directly into the one story everyone already associated with Belfast, and it did so at exactly the moment the peace process needed a symbol of something other than conflict to sell to the rest of the world. Beginning in 2003, a Dublin-based development group acquired 185 acres of the old shipyard site for £47 million and began transforming it into what became known as Titanic Quarter, one of the largest waterfront regeneration projects in Europe at the time, with an approved master plan following in 2007. Its centerpiece, Titanic Belfast, opened on the centenary of the ship's sinking in April 2012, a £97 million museum shaped like 4 ship hulls and clad in 3,000 individual silver panels, built directly beside the actual slipways where the Titanic and her sister ships were laid down and launched. It drew over 800,000 visitors in its first year alone and has maintained similar numbers ever since, welcoming over 813,000 people in the most recent full year on record, becoming Northern Ireland's single most visited attraction by a wide margin. More than £700 million has since been invested across the wider quarter, now home to film studios, a Belfast Metropolitan College campus, apartments, offices, and a marina with berths for 40 leisure craft, on ground that sat almost entirely derelict and empty throughout the 1990s, its cranes silent, its slipways cracked and overgrown. Walk through Belfast city centre today and the contrast with the Troubles era is almost disorienting. Where downtown Belfast once emptied out at night behind a literal security ring of steel, checkpoints and bag searches are a routine part of daily life for anyone entering the commercial core. The same streets now host busy pubs, microbreweries, and a gleaming Ulster University campus, helping pull students and young professionals back into a city centre that spent 30 years being avoided rather than visited after dark. Some peace walls still stand in parts of West Belfast, running between the Falls Road and the Shankill and elsewhere, quiet reminders that the divisions the Troubles exposed didn't vanish the moment a peace agreement was signed on a Friday in April, and that many communities across the city still live largely separate lives even now, more than a quarter century later, sending their children to different schools and drinking in different pubs without ever quite discussing why. But down at the harbour, where 2 immigrants once bet everything on outbuilding Glasgow and Liverpool, where a workforce split by religion built the most famous ship in the world, and where that same city later fought something close to a civil war with itself for 3 decades, visitors now stand on the actual slipway where the Titanic was launched and take photographs, queue for tickets, and buy souvenirs. The ship's failure somehow having become the vessel, almost literally, for the city's recovery. Nobody designed it that way. It simply turned out that the one story the whole world already wanted to hear about Belfast was the one that let the city talk about something other than the war it had just finished having with itself.